The JFK 35 podcast is produced by the JFK Library Foundation and made possible with the help of a generous grant from the Blanche and Irving Laurie Foundation.
JFK 35 is a production of the JFK Library Foundation. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed are the guest's own and do not represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of others at the JFK Library Foundation or the JFK Library, including staff, board, or donors.
So she understood her place in that history and that it would be important for the historical record to have her collection and to have that be available to the American people as well.
When Jacqueline Kennedy arrived at the White House, she didn't just move into the nation's most famous home, she transformed it. With a vision rooted in history and a passion for preservation, she restored the spirit of America's past to the People's House and changed it forever.
Today, JFK Library Foundation Executive Director Rachel Flor gives us a behind-the-scenes look at the original documents that reveal how the First Lady reimagined the White House, and we'll also hear about one of President Kennedy's closest friends, through his own words preserved in an oral history. That's all coming up on JFK 35.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
Hello, I'm Matt Porter.
And I'm Jamie Richardson. Welcome to a new season of JFK 35. The John F. Kennedy Presidential Library is home to more than 24 million documents, 500,000 photographs, 35,000 artifacts, and tens of thousands of audio and video recordings. Together, they tell the story of a president, a family, and an era that reshaped America.
From drafts of historic speeches to rarely seen family photos, the library's collections reveal the personal moments and pivotal decisions that defined JFK's presidency. And this season, we're taking a look into the archives and museum artifact collections. Each episode will invite staff members from the library and the foundation to share the items that inspire them most and the stories behind why they matter.
Our guest this week is JFK Library Foundation Executive Director Rachel Flor. Rachel has led the foundation since 2020 and has been with the foundation for almost 20 years.
Rachel, we're so glad to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So Rachel, great to have you. And you wanted to start, you have one of your first picks is related to the White House restoration. And this is perhaps one of the most tangible parts of Jacqueline Kennedy's legacy as First Lady. And can you describe what you picked for us today?
Sure. So I have to say it was really hard for me to pick just 3 items from our collection and archive here at the JFK Library. There's so many different ways into the Kennedy story and this history through the records here. But one of the formative experiences in my career at the JFK Library Foundation was working as Director of Communication on the opening of the Jacqueline Kennedy personal papers back in 2012. And this was the first time that her papers as First Lady were made available to the public. And they really, as all of our records do, provide a window into her work and her interests as First Lady and also her impact and, who she was as a person and how she approached the role. So it was really exciting to work on the opening, just knowing kind of how little I think people know about her. There's a perception of her, of course she's wildly known across the globe as transformational person as First Lady, but often people focus on her clothing and her style, and that's kind of the surface of what she brought to the country. And she's just so much more of an interesting person, and these records really tell that story. She was really young when she entered the White House in her early 30s and had a deep interest in art and in history, and particularly American history, and immediately kind of recognized that the White House, which is meant to be a symbol of the country, of course, had very little history. She noted that there were almost no furnishings left that were older than I think, like the 1940s, and here we are in the 1960s. So there was just very little history of the families that had lived there, the members of the families of the American presidents, and of the country's history. So she set out, that became really her mission, to bring history back to the White House, and started with getting the White House designated as a historical monument.
Which is kind of crazy that it wasn't a historical monument at that point.
Right. I mean, I think we take for granted that the White House is a representative of American history and culture, and that's really thanks to her. There were no rules around items that were kept there, how they were kept, how they were displayed, and the stories that they told. And she really worked to fix that. And one of the first things she did was undertake a scholarly restoration of the White House. So she didn't like the word renovation because it undervalued the scholarly process of bringing back the items, the furnishings, the artwork, et cetera, that had been in the White House over the years, and archiving them, cataloging them, displaying them, and telling their stories to the American people. So her collection is just a trove of evidence, I would say, historical evidence of her deep interest and curiosity, intellectual curiosity around the history of the White House and the history of the presidency, and also deep knowledge of American art. So she has she has this incredible attention to detail. I mean, legendary attention to detail. She was so intentional about setting up, about really this entire sort of scholarly process and who she involved and how she approached the work. And one of the documents that I'll never forget, and it was over a decade ago that I was doing this work to open this collection, there's a document where she's talking about cataloging the items that are being brought back to the White House, these historical items, and talking about actually the pen or how they would be marked, the markings that they would use to do the cataloging. So she's thinking in that level of detail about how this work can be best approached, and she makes a note that on the china, there should be they could use a red pen, but it might wash off. And she knows that at the Met, they use a special paint, red paint, that only a chemical can take off. And so she suggests that maybe they look into red paint for the markings on the china to catalog this collection. And I just think that's kind of incredible that you'd have a first lady that's that invested in historical restoration of the White House, and ultimately from there making it available to the public through the White House Historical Association, which she established, and the White House Guidebook. She knew when she had come to tour the White House that there wasn't a guidebook, and that many people will never get the opportunity to tour the White House. So as part of this restoration, she created the White House Guidebook that continues to be published today and is such an important way for people all over the world, and particularly Americans, to better access the White House and the history of the White House and how it's furnished and presented to the world.
She's such an amazing person. Before we move on, I think, to the next topic, I just wanted to ask, what was it for you? You're yourself running this organization, this nonprofit, and you have a lot of details to look at. What was it like to sort of learn about, sort of Mrs. Kennedy's attention to detail? She was essentially creating from scratch a new organization that would take care of the White House.
I really, you can learn a lot from her leadership by looking at her collection and how she thought about the approach. What I take away from her leadership on establishing the White House Historical Association and undertaking this restoration was just the intentionality behind it. And I think And the same could be said for her fashion. In addition to style, there was a lot of intentionality around the details of what she chose to wear, what it meant to in a particular diplomatic situation. The same went for the work that she did around in the White House. She was so particular, and it wasn't simply because she was interested in details. It was because she really wanted to be intentional. She understood the historic, sort of the profoundness of the place that the White House has in American culture, and wanted to really represent that history accurately and to reflect sort of the broad experiences of presidents and their families in the White House. And also she understood her place in that history, and that it would be important for the historical record to have her collection and to have that be available to the American people as well. So I think that she was extraordinarily intentional, but also and scholarly in her approach, very curious to learn. You see that throughout all of her papers, that she was sort of always in a stance of learning about this history and better understanding it, bringing in experts. She created a committee of experts to help with this undertaking and ensure its accuracy and its integrity.
And this kind of culminates with the White House restoration isn't done by this point, but she has the tour, the televised tour, actually on Valentine's Day, 1962, and it kind of shows, you get a lot of that in the written documents, and you get to see her in the tour. It's actually in the museum downstairs below us, which I just watched recently. And that curiosity and that, we do this here, we do that there. And I don't know, I just love seeing that excellence and that kind of level of detail and attention and love of the history. And, it's protocol, but it's just important to have, we do things for a reason.
Exactly. And this is a person, you really see it in the tour. This is not somebody who sort of swooped in at the end and took credit for it and, was the face of a project. This is someone who knows she knows what kind of paint you used to mark and catalog the China collection. That's the kind of hands-on approach she had with this project. And she herself, probably wouldn't have represented herself as a historian or an art historian or an expert, but has a level of expertise in this area and knew, all of the kind of history and the background of these different furnishings and the collections in the White House. And the stories, of the presidents themselves. And she was able to tell those stories and represent and sort of give a window to the American people into it and really into what she knew, which was incredibly substantive. And you also see that in her papers. So they're not digitized, so you do have to come to the JFK Library to see them. But in the papers, there's also a lot of planning for that tour, where she was very much involved in the process of developing the script and figuring out what they would highlight and how it would be presented. So I just love that, this was a person who was in the weeds, who knows her stuff, and is incredibly curious, and that curiosity led her to basically feed the country's curiosity about, she didn't kind of limit it to herself, that she gets this access to the White House. She wants to create access for the rest of the country, and that's what she does through the tour, through the White House Guidebook, through the White House Historical Association.
All right, now moving on from Mrs. Kennedy to President Kennedy and a friend that he had for a long time, his entire life. When he met him in high school at Choate in 1933, the man's name is Lem Billings. And, the library has many oral histories here, including an oral history from Kirk Lemoyne Billings. His nickname is Lem. Out of all the oral histories, why did this one speak to you, Rachel?
So before I talk about why this one speaks to me, I just want to talk a little bit about the oral histories, because that's actually, when I first was thinking about what my picks would be, I wasn't really thinking about Lem, but more the medium, the archival medium of the oral history that I just love and I think is completely underappreciated and undervalued sort of outside the archival world. So I just want to talk a little bit about what oral histories are. What's so special about them is that they are one person's perspective on time in history that we may all kind of know a little bit about, and we probably know it from sort of a general perspective. So the historian perspective, which might be kind of a compilation of having used a lot of different resources, or the public perspective is, most often, particularly with a public figure like President Kennedy, his speeches and the big major events and how they unfolded. But the oral histories give you a window into all that history, but from a particular person's human experience and human perspective. And so in our oral history collection, you might see the same events unfold through the eyes of many different people, from Mrs. Kennedy to his friends to his staff, and they all give a different angle on the same time period. And for me, having that personal perspective is invaluable and also fascinating. I mean, just kind of the details that they tend to remember that add layers of kind of interest and understanding to a time and events that we might think we kind of know and have seen are just so interesting. So a lot of our oral history collection is digitized. They also have transcripts. And I would encourage people, it's a rabbit hole of interest. And I would encourage anyone who's interested in this particular time period in American history to really pick an oral history, somebody who maybe you don't know well but had a front row seat to this administration, and spend some time in their shoes and understand what it was like for them based on their life experiences, based on who they were and where they stood in the ecosystem of the Kennedy administration. And I promise you'll learn something. So I'll start with that. Just a shout out to the oral history program, and we have incredible archivists who work on making those available. And Lem, I picked Lem because it's a good example of a perspective that adds to your understanding of the president. And I think that's really the goal of the oral histories. It's not because they're fact, like by nature, oral histories are subjective. And you should approach them as such. These are people who had relationships with the president and with the administration, and fundamentally are going to be seen telling their story in a subjective way. And that's what's so interesting about them. So you get Lem Billings, who was a very close friend of President Kennedy. I know you've done really interesting podcasts, at least one really interesting podcast on him and his friendship with President Kennedy. They met in high school, at boarding school, and had a lifelong friendship. What's interesting about Lem is that he never sought to really have a formal role in the administration. I think he was offered opportunities and just liked to be the friend, and was the friend throughout President Kennedy's life. But so you get this oral history. So this is his friend, and high school friend, no less. So one thing, and this is just to give you a taste of what this oral history is like, it starts, and I think the question is about, when did they meet? When was the first time that Lem went, and he spent a lot of time with JFK's family, and in Palm Beach over Christmases, but also in Hyannisport. And he said, the first time, and it's kind of offhand, like the first time he went to Hyannisport, there was a faulty shower and he got burned and was in the hospital for 3 weeks. So he really got to know the family that way, because they were visiting him in the hospital for 3 weeks after he got burned at their summer house. And it's kind of like this aside, but it's so fascinating to me. You get this very sort of rich, immediate familiarity with this family, and that you would never get in a history book or just reading, the surface of kind of who the Kennedy family was and how they existed. And I just love that kind of intrigue that pops up throughout these oral histories, and particularly with Lem, where he, the meat of his stories, I think the sort of the best, most revealing part of the oral history is him telling about their travels to Europe. And it was a time, and we know this, that was very much an awakening for John F. Kennedy, as he's a young person traveling throughout Europe on sort of the brink of World War II, or in the lead up to, I would say. And he's very interested in foreign policy, which is something that we see in him throughout his life, but he's experiencing it firsthand. So Lem is able to give sort of insight about how that experience went. And sort of another, I would say almost an aside, is in the oral history, Lem's talking about their travels, and they're in Germany. And he says, and we missed Hitler by 3 days, like in Nuremberg. There was a huge Nazi convening rally, I don't know exactly what it would have been called, with Hitler while they were, traveling in Germany. And so these two historic figures kind of almost crossed paths that way, and didn't by a matter of 3 days. And of course, JFK ends up fighting in World War II in the South Pacific, and it became a very formative part of his life. And so I find that kind of hearing those little anecdotes, and, for Lem, he's just telling stories. It's just his childhood. But for us, it adds a layer of understanding of really the context in which John F. Kennedy grew as a leader, as certainly like his public policy, and as ultimately as president. So I highly recommend checking out all of the oral histories. Particularly, I think Lem Billings' oral history is really interesting window into President Kennedy's growth from a high schooler to leader of the free world.
The oral history of Lem is so, as you said, has so many great anecdotes. And Lem was someone who was with President Kennedy when he was in high school, and then stayed close to the president. He had his own room in the White House that he could go. He was seen in so many pictures behind President Kennedy on vacations that some people confused him for being a Secret Service agent. And I think, we can't end this Lem story without knowing that, Lem as a person was a gay man, something that had to be a secret at the time. But President Kennedy seems to have known from early on in the relationship. What does it say to you that in a time where being a gay man was not a good thing, could be detrimental to your career, that President Kennedy not only stayed with Lem, but really kept him close?
Well, I think we see with Lem and their relationship a deep loyalty. There were a few other people in President Kennedy's life who were incredibly loyal to him, and he in turn was loyal to them. And I think the evidence shows, and just their relationship, that deep relationship, and knowing what he knew about Lem as a gay man and how that could have been problematic for his presidency and otherwise, we can only guess that the friendship was more important than the risk. And I think that says a lot about President Kennedy also as a human.
So, thank you so much for giving so much of your time. I think the next thing we just want to ask you is, what do you hope from these artifacts, the White House restoration documents, Lem's oral history, and all the other things kept here? What do you hope that these documents will help people learn now and in the future?
Well, what is so important about primary sources is that you can really consume them yourself. The goal is that we're providing access to all of this material, as much of this material as possible, and that people are able to consume it and through their own curiosity spend time with the primary sources and come up with their own conclusions on what's interesting about this administration and what they can learn from it. So unlike history books, which often tell you what you should know, the archive here is a discovery. And I think you can hear, from my own discovery in the archives, you ultimately will have a relationship with the stories yourself. And ideally, people are drawing their own conclusions about this history and about this administration and what it means in, contemporary life. So the goal is discovery, it's learning, and it's really about providing access to the original so that you can draw your own conclusions.
Just that, you're talking about, we don't have a lot of primary sources of what JFK thought himself about. We have his diary from the 1937 trip, but other than that, he didn't have time after the presidency to write a memoir like other folks do. So when we have things like the oral histories with Lem Billings, we get to see, that little bit more of an insight than just the public persona. So I'm glad you brought in that one because it gives you such a personal look of his growth and him as a person, as a teen, as a serious, thoughtful student, not so serious student, and then as president.
Yeah, I think that's what the collection here can do for us is it's almost like an onion. So you have sort of the top layer that is really well known and broadly understood, and then you get to peel back a layer here, and maybe you're in the museum and you learn a little bit more, and there's another kind of history or layer of history presented or layer of understanding of this history. And then if you really want to learn more and you're really curious, you can keep peeling back layers with all of these different artifacts and collections that we have here to provide more insight and better understanding of the person, of the leadership, and of the legacy. And that's what's so special about archives, and particularly presidential archives.
Well, thank you so much, Rachel. We appreciate your time.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you for listening to our latest episode in our special Staff Pick series. If you're interested in learning more about some of the items we discussed today, you can visit our podcast page for this episode. It includes links to all of the items we mentioned today.
If you have questions or story ideas, email us at jfk35pod@jfklfoundation.org or tag us at JFK Library FDN on social or use the hashtag JFK35. If you liked what you heard today, please consider subscribing to our podcast or leaving us a review wherever you get your podcasts.